Beneath the oceans, where waves now crash and tides endlessly rise and fall, there once stretched vast continents, lands of rivers and plains, forests and fire-lit nights. Today, only the sea knows their outlines, only the deep keeps their silence. Yet, in an age before memory, before stone was carved into temples or words were pressed into clay, these vanished worlds were alive with voices, footsteps, and the breath of the first tribes. They were the original theaters of humanity, places where our ancestors stood beneath ancient skies and began the long story of survival, wonder, and belonging. To imagine them is to summon a ghost landscape, a geography drawn not on maps but in echoes. Sundaland, Sahul, Doggerland, Beringia, names given by modern science, yet, for those who walked their shores, they were simply home. They were the lands where children learned to gather food, where hunters set out with spears carved from bone, and where songs first rose to the stars. The earth we inherit today is only a fragment of what once existed. So much is gone, swallowed not by war or fire, but by the slow and unstoppable tide. The end of the Ice Age was both a gift and a sentence. As glaciers melted, waters rose, rivers swelled, lakes grew restless, and seas crept across the edges of the world. Valleys became gulfs, hills became islands. Entire homelands were erased within a few generations. For those who lived there, it was not myth but memory, a world that changed before their eyes. And yet, even in disappearance, these continents became eternal. Their ghosts lived on in stories, in myths of floods and drowned kingdoms, whispered across cultures separated by oceans but united by remembrance. Consider, for a moment, the silence of the deep sea today. Beneath the North Sea, beneath the Indian Ocean, beneath the Bering Strait, there are bones and stones, tools and hearths, remnants of meals once shared by firelight. They are unreachable for most of us, hidden beneath layers of sand and silt, but they exist. They remind us that civilization is never as permanent as we imagine. Every city, every nation, every structure we raise is built upon ground that can one day vanish. This first step in our journey is not about certainty, but about humility. We must begin with the acknowledgement that the world humanity knew in its earliest chapters is gone, yet, its absence shapes us still. The sea does not erase completely, it conceals. And in its concealment, it compels us to wonder. Close your eyes and picture it, not water, but endless grasslands where the North Sea now rolls. Herds of reindeer and mammoth, moving across Doggerland, watched by tribes who followed them with sharp eyes and sharper spears. Imagine Sundaland, a vast land bridging islands that today stand separate, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, once bound together by rivers feeding fertile plains. Families built shelters from palm and bamboo, listening to the constant chorus of cicadas. Picture Sahul, stretching from New Guinea to Australia, alive with strange creatures, giant kangaroos, flightless birds taller than men, and marsupial lions lurking in the shadows. Picture the Beringian steppe, stretching from Siberia to Alaska, a frozen but passable bridge to the Americas. These were not marginal spaces. They were the centers of life, the stages where humanity rehearsed its courage. The lost continent is not a single place. It is an idea, woven from many vanished homelands, each one swallowed by rising waters but remembered in fragments. It is Atlantis, yes, but it is also every small village pulled under by the relentless sea, every coastal plain erased by shifting tides. When we speak of lost continents, we are speaking of humanity's first and deepest encounter with impermanence. For the tribes who lived then, the earth itself was unstable, shifting, vanishing. Survival demanded not only strength, but imagination. And perhaps this is why we remember. Long before writing, long before history was carved into stone, people told stories of floods. From Mesopotamia to the Pacific Islands, from India to the Americas, cultures share memories of water rising, of lands drowned, of people forced to leave their homes behind. These are not coincidences. They are the lingering voices of a time when the earth itself seemed to rise against us, reshaping the boundaries of the known world. We begin here, at the edge of memory, because to understand the tribes who lived on those continents, we must first understand the fragility of land itself. Every horizon is temporary. Every homeland is borrowed. The continents we walk today are only chapters in a longer story. And just as the first tribes watched their lands sink beneath the sea, so too may our own civilizations one day vanish. But there is beauty in this thought. The drowned lands are not merely losses, they are reminders of resilience. Humanity did not end with their disappearance. It adapted. It moved. It carried with it fire, song, and memory, scattering across the world like sparks in the wind. The lost continents are both grave and cradle, burial grounds of worlds, birthplaces of courage. So let us begin this journey as the ocean does, with depth, with patience, with the rhythm of waves. We are not only reconstructing geography, we are reconstructing the emotional landscape of our ancestors, the fear and wonder of watching the earth change beneath their feet. This is not just science. It is story. It is memory. It is the shared, permanent. Archaeologists and anthropologists now listen to these stories alongside the evidence of geology. Where myth speaks of a drowned valley, sonar scans sometimes reveal the ridges of an ancient riverbed beneath the sea. Where a people remembers a flood, ice cores reveal the sudden warming and melting that followed the Ice Age. The Earth speaks, and humanity's oldest voices confirm what it says. Together, they reconstruct not only the shape of the lost continents, but also the lives once lived there. And there is a kind of haunting beauty in this. We often think of history as a straight line, beginning with agriculture, leading to cities, rising toward our present moment. But prehistory reminds us that much has already been lost, that humanity once filled worlds we no longer see. The line is broken. There are gaps. There are pages missing from the book of time. Imagine walking across the seabed of the English Channel, not filled with water, but with green valleys, rivers winding between hills. Imagine walking in Sunderland, across plains that stretched farther than any modern island, alive with elephants, rhinoceroses, and early humans fishing in vast deltas. Imagine walking across Beringia, surrounded by endless tundra, under cold stars, the breath of mammoths steaming in the air. These are not mere reconstructions. They are the recognition that the earth has lived many lives, and humanity has lived alongside them all. The fragments left behind are not enough to restore the whole, yet they are enough to remind us. A shard of pottery, lifted from the silt, is more than clay. It is the ghost of a hand that shaped it. A spear point, dredged from the sea floor, is more than stone. It is a story of survival, of hunts long forgotten. Each discovery is both evidence and echo. This is why the search for lost continents is more than science. It is an act of remembrance. It is a way of listening to the earth's long memory and realizing that we are part of it. We are not separate from these drowned landscapes. We are descended from them. Their soil, their rivers, their vanished forests nurtured the first tribes, whose blood flows in us still. And so, fragments become more than fragments. They are reminders that the earth changes, and always will. Continents rise, continents fall. Oceans expand, oceans retreat. What seems eternal is never so. The lost continents were real, and they remind us that our own world is just as fragile, just as temporary. To hold a piece of flint, shaped by hands 20,000 years ago, is to feel both the nearness and the distance of time. The earth remembers, even when we forget. In the beginning, before villages and walls, before metal and written word, there was fire. To the first tribes who roamed the drowned continents, fire was more than warmth. It was life itself, a fragile miracle that transformed darkness into safety, raw meat into nourishment, silence into song. When the world was still untamed, when night pressed down like a weight and shadows moved like predators, fire was the center around which humanity learned to gather. Picture the scene, an endless plain stretching across Doggerland, the winds cold and biting. A small band of hunters has returned, carrying the meat of reindeer felled in the marsh. Around them, children shiver in the mist. Then, flint strikes against flint, a shower of bright orange fragments falling into dry moss. For a moment, nothing. Then a curl of smoke. Then a flame. And suddenly, the night is broken. The hunters exhale in relief, mothers bring their children close, and the fire begins to grow. It is more than heat. It is belonging. Across Sunderland, Sahul, Beringia, Doggerland, everywhere humanity spread, the fire was the heart of life. Around it, people learned to cook food, releasing nourishment locked in roots, grains, and meat. Around it, they drove away predators, lions in the grass, wolves at the edge of sight. Around it, they told stories, the flicker of flames making shadows on cave walls, bringing spirits to life. Fire became the first technology, but also the first symbol, the first mystery. It was dangerous, unpredictable, a force that could destroy entire forests, yet one that could also cradle a family through the coldest of nights. The first fires were not always made. Often, they were found, gifts from lightning strikes, from lava flows, from smoldering trees after storms. To capture fire was to harness the wild, to take something untamed and make it serve human need. It is easy for us to imagine fire as common, simple, but for those earliest tribes, it was divine. Its smoke rose upward like prayer. Its light revealed not only the faces of kin, but also the possibility of a future. The fire circle was humanity's first gathering place. Before temples, before cities, before agriculture, it was here that tribes came together in shared space. Children learned language in its glow. Elders told the histories of their people. Hunters described the chase, the paths of animals, the changes of the seasons. Fire turned silence into conversation and conversation into memory. In this way, fire was not only warmth for the body, but warmth for the mind. It sparked imagination. It allowed stories to be remembered and passed forward. In the deep forests of Sahul, where marsupial lions prowled, fire kept danger away. In the frozen tundra of Beringia, where endless winds howled, fire meant survival in temperatures that could kill. In Sundaland's lush river valleys, fire cleared spaces in the jungle, making room for shelter, for gathering, for safety. Across every drowned continent, fire was the equalizer. It gave fragile humans, slow runners, soft-skinned, vulnerable against tooth and claw, a weapon that reshaped the balance of nature. But fire was never just practical. For the first tribes, it was mystery. How could stone create spark? How could dry wood suddenly glow with a light that seemed alive? It moved, it danced, it consumed, it breathed. It was no wonder that fire became sacred in nearly every culture that followed. To control fire was to bridge the gap between human and divine. Around flames, rituals began. Offerings were made. Ashes became part of burial practices. The tribe and the fire grew inseparable. Imagine a night on the lost continent of Doggerland. Rain falls in the distance. Beyond the circle of firelight, the world is black. Eyes gleam from the dark, perhaps wolves, perhaps spirits imagined by fearful minds. Within the circle, however, there is warmth. A woman sings, her voice rising above the crackle of wood. Children laugh, carving small shapes from bone. The hunters rest, their weapons leaning against logs. In this small circle of light, the human world is defined. The fire makes boundaries. It tells the tribe where we end and the wilderness begins. As generations passed, knowledge of fire became one of the first inheritances. Children learned not only how to strike flint, but also how to keep embers alive, to carry them in bundles of bark from place to place. Fire was fragile, and so care became tradition. A flame was never allowed to die without reason, for to lose fire was to invite death, to be cast back into darkness. Some tribes even believed fire itself was a spirit, one that could be angered or appeased. To let it die was to betray a sacred bond. Science tells us that the mastery of fire was a turning point in human evolution. It allowed more calories to be consumed from food, which in turn fueled larger brains. It extended waking hours, enabling people to plan, create, and imagine long after the sun had set. It was the light in which art was born, where myths first took shape. Without fire, there is no humanity as we know it. The drowned continents were not only landscapes of survival, but landscapes of illumination, where humanity's inner fire was mirrored in the flames they tended. And yet, fire also carried danger. Whole forests could be lost if flames escaped control. Camps could be destroyed. People who relied on fire knew they held both a gift and a curse. This duality, destruction and creation, shaped human thought. Perhaps it is no coincidence that myths of gods, demons, and creation often center around fire. It was the first force humanity both feared and revered. As we look back on the lost continents, we must remember that their greatest monuments are not stones beneath the waves, but the invisible legacy of fire. Around it, tribes became communities. Around it, memory became tradition. Around it, survival became culture. The flickering light of the first fires did not vanish with the drowning of lands. It traveled forward, carried in embers, carried in stories, carried in us. Even now, when we light candles in darkness, when we gather by campfires, when we stare into flames and fall silent, we are repeating gestures that began tens of thousands of years ago. Fire connects us to those who came before. It is the unbroken thread between us and the first tribes who lived on continents we will never see again. The fire still burns. In every flame is the echo of a million nights long gone, nights when the first humans sat together at the edge of the world and realized they were no longer alone. To modern eyes, the ocean often feels like a boundary, a vast expanse that separates nations, peoples, and continents. It is the frontier that divides land from land, the barrier between what is known and what lies beyond the horizon. But for the first tribes who lived on the lost continents, the sea was not only an obstacle, it was also a pathway. It was the shifting, living surface upon which courage was tested and futures were carried. When ice locked much of the world in frozen silence, oceans were lower, and shorelines stretched far beyond where they are today. The continents of Sundaland, Sahul, Doggerland, and Beringia were bordered by coasts that no longer exist, lines erased beneath rising seas. To live on those coasts was to live in constant dialogue with the ocean. It gave food, it gave movement, it gave connection. For the first tribes, water was not the end of the world, but the beginning of journeys. Imagine standing on the edge of Sundaland, where rivers flowed into deltas rich with fish, and mangroves stretched endlessly into the tide. Out beyond the horizon lay islands that would one day be Borneo or Java. To reach them required courage. A tribe might build rafts of bamboo lashed with vine or hollow canoes carved from ancient trees. They had no maps, no compasses, no written words to guide them. What they had was memory, songs and stories that carried knowledge of stars, of tides, of the way the wind shifted across seasons. The ocean, vast and unknown, became legible through story. Each crossing was a gamble. Waves rose like walls, storms threatened to shatter fragile craft, and beneath the surface swam creatures unseen. Yet people went. Again and again, they paddled into horizons they could not see, carrying with them fire, tools, seeds, and hope. To understand this is to understand the depth of human bravery. The ocean was never empty. It was alive with danger, but also alive with possibility. In Beringia, the sea froze into bridges of ice and tundra, linking Asia and the Americas. For tribes who crossed it, the ocean became a highway, wide and desolate, yet filled with the promise of lands beyond. Herds of mammoth and bison wandered across, and with them went hunters, families, and entire tribes, chasing life into new worlds. The sea here was not sailed, but walked, transformed by ice into a solid expanse. It was still ocean, but it was ocean reshaped, ocean temporarily stilled for human passage. Doggerland tells a different story. Its rivers and lakes flowed into the North Sea, offering fish and trade routes between scattered communities. The waters were not to be feared, but embraced. They connected rather than divided. Canoes carved from hollow logs moved silently across marshes, carrying hunters to new grounds. Here, the ocean was not a distant horizon, but a daily companion, always close, always giving. When it finally rose and claimed the land, it must have felt like a betrayal, a friend turned hostile. What unites these stories is a truth, both scientific and spiritual. The sea is never only an obstacle. It is teacher, provider, and guide. Those who lived along the lost continents learned to read its moods. They knew the rhythm of tides, the pull of currents, the flight of seabirds that signaled land beyond sight. They listened to the winds, they studied the stars, and in doing so, they unlocked pathways invisible to the untrained eye. We often think of early humans as bound to land, hesitant, fearful of water. But the truth is more profound. Long before recorded history, people were already voyagers. The settlement of Sahul, over 60,000 years ago, required crossing at least 70 miles of open sea, a feat not of accident, but of intent. These were not castaways. They were navigators. They carried fire and memory across waves. They knew where they were going, and they knew how to get there. The ocean also shaped imagination. Myths of water deities, sea spirits, and sacred journeys across waves are among humanity's oldest. To push out into the unknown sea was not just an act of survival, it was an act of faith. Each crossing was a prayer, each landing a revelation. The sea taught humility, for even the strongest tribe could be humbled by a sudden storm. Yet it also taught unity, for no one could face it alone. Rafts were built together, paddled together, survived together. Imagine a night voyage, the stars vast above, the water black beneath. The horizon, invisible. A tribe huddled on a raft, listening to the creak of wood and the hiss of waves. In the distance, seabirds cry, and the leader points to their flight. Land lies that way, he says, not with certainty, but with inherited knowledge. Hours later, as dawn breaks, a new shoreline rises. Children cheer, elders weep, and a new chapter of human history begins. This is the image repeated countless times across continents, across millennia, the ocean as threshold and humanity bold enough to cross it. Even today, when we gaze out over the sea, we feel something of this. The horizon stirs both fear and longing. We imagine what lies beyond, we sense its vastness, and we are humbled. This feeling is ancient. It belongs to the first tribes who pushed beyond sight, who made the sea not wall, but bridge. Their courage carved pathways across the globe. Without them, humanity would have remained confined, limited. Because they saw the ocean as a pathway, not a barrier, the world became humanity's world. And so, when we speak of the lost continents, we must remember the waters that shaped them. Their boundaries were never static, always shifting. Land and sea traded places, and humanity learned to move with them. The tribes who crossed these oceans left no maps, no monuments, but their legacy lives in us. Each of us is a descendant of voyagers, of people who looked at the sea and chose not to stop. The ocean was their challenge, their companion, their road. It still is ours. Beneath the warm waters of Southeast Asia, between the islands we now call Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula, lies the ghost of a continent. Today, it is hidden, its rivers, valleys, and forests buried under the South China Sea and the Java Sea. But for tens of thousands of years, Sundaland was alive. It was one of the most fertile regions on Earth, a land where rivers wound like silver threads across endless plains, where forests breathed with ancient life, and where human tribes flourished. To imagine Sundaland is to imagine not an empty land, but a homeland, one of the first cradles where humanity found abundance, community, and continuity. At the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. What we now call islands were peaks of mountains standing above a vast continental shelf. The South China Sea was not water, but plain, a floodplain rich with rivers, swamps, and fertile soil. Great rivers flowed across it, larger than any that remain in the region today. The Mekong, the Irrawaddy, and countless others joined into a network that carved valleys, created deltas, and nourished forests filled with elephants, rhinoceroses, and tigers. It was a place of extraordinary biodiversity, a land where human tribes thrived, not at the margins, but at the center of a vast ecosystem. Picture a morning in Sundaland, 20,000 years ago. Mist drifts above a wide river. In the forest canopy, gibbons call to one another, their voices echoing across valleys. On the riverbank, a family of humans prepares nets woven from plant fibers. Children help untangle the lines, while elders sharpen tools of stone and bone. The water teems with fish, enough to feed not just one family, but an entire community. Birds scatter as the net is cast, splashing silver shapes that will soon be pulled ashore. Life here was not always easy, but it was abundant. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sundaland may have supported some of the largest populations of humans during the Ice Age. Its fertile soil, rich rivers, and vast forests provided stability in a world otherwise filled with extremes of cold and scarcity. For tribes here, survival was not only possible, but promising. They built shelters of bamboo and palm, used fire to clear forest undergrowth, and developed an intimate knowledge of the land. They knew the tracks of elephants, the migrations of deer, the seasons of fruiting trees. Their world was alive with patterns, and in learning them, they carved out permanence. Yet Sundaland was not static. Even at its height, water crept at its edges. The rivers that nourished life also foretold its end. As the Ice Age waned and glaciers melted, the sea began to rise. At first, the change was slow, barely noticeable within a single lifetime. A village moved its huts back from the shore, a hunting ground shrank, a river shifted its course. But over centuries, the encroachment became undeniable. Marshes grew deeper. Lowland forests disappeared. Entire valleys flooded. For the tribes of Sundaland, this rising tide must have seemed like a living force. The land itself was vanishing. Myths of flood and drowning, still told today in the cultures of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, may echo this memory. Stories of wrathful seas, of worlds swallowed overnight, of ancestors forced to flee inland. These are fragments of memory that survived long after the land itself was gone. The drowning of Sundaland was not only an environmental event, it was a cultural fracture. Communities that had once been connected by rivers and plains became isolated on shrinking islands. What had been one continent became many: Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Bali, the Malay Peninsula. Each became its own world, separated by water where once there had been land. Traditions diverged, languages changed, myths evolved differently. Yet beneath those differences lingered a shared origin, the memory of a drowned homeland. Modern science has only recently begun to reconstruct Sundaland. Bathymetric maps of the ocean floor reveal the contours of valleys and ridges that once stood above water. Sonar scans show riverbeds still etched into the seabed. Sediment cores reveal pollen from plants that grew on dry land, now sealed beneath layers of sand. Every discovery adds another fragment, another glimpse of a continent erased, not by fire or war, but by the slow inevitability of water. And still, so much remains hidden. Archaeologists know that beneath the waves lie settlements, tools, and bones of those who lived and died here. Divers occasionally find artifacts, stone tools, bones of animals no longer living, but the vastness of the sea makes exploration nearly impossible. Sundaland remains a mystery, a half-seen shadow, its full story waiting in silence. Yet even in absence, Sundaland shapes us. Some scientists suggest that the region's drowning may have inspired myths of great floods that spread across the world. Others argue that it played a crucial role in human migration, serving as a hub from which tribes spread into the Pacific, into East Asia, and beyond. If so, then Sundaland was not only a homeland, but a crossroads, a place where humanity expanded outward into the wider world. The emotional weight of Sundaland is profound. To imagine an entire continent filled with forests, rivers, and people, now lying hidden beneath the sea, is to confront impermanence on a scale almost incomprehensible. Cities may fall, empires may crumble, but here was something larger, a whole geography erased. For the people who lived through it, the grief must have been immense. To see the land of ancestors disappear, to abandon sacred sites, to leave behind graves swallowed by water, this was not simply adaptation. It was loss. And yet humanity endured. The people of Sundaland did not vanish with their land. They adapted, moving inland or across the sea. They carried with them songs, tools, and memory. They became the ancestors of countless cultures that inhabit Southeast Asia today. Though the continent drowned, its spirit lived on in those who refused to disappear. To stand now on the shores of Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines is to stand at the edge of Sundaland. The mountains of Java are its ridges. The forests of Borneo are its remnants. The shallow seas are its valleys. Though hidden, it remains present, a ghost continent just beneath the waves. Perhaps this is the deeper truth of Sundaland, that even when worlds are lost, they are never truly gone. They survive in fragments, in stone tools lifted from the seabed, in myths told by firelight, in the very blood of those who walk the land today. The drowned homeland still whispers, still breathes, still shapes who we are. Sundaland reminds us that the earth is not fixed. Continents rise and fall, coasts expand and retreat. What seems permanent is always temporary. And yet, within that impermanence, humanity finds continuity. The people of Sundaland lived, loved, and endured. Their land is gone, but their legacy remains. To remember Sundaland is not only to reconstruct a continent, but to honor the resilience of those who called it home. Beneath the waves lies a world of memory, a reminder that even in loss, humanity finds ways to endure, to adapt, and to carry its story forward. The earth is never still. Beneath its calm appearance, it shifts, breathes, and changes with a rhythm far older than human memory. 20,000 years ago, ice held the world in its grip. Vast glaciers stretched across continents, locking away oceans in frozen prisons. But as the ice age waned, the slow inevitability of warmth returned. Glaciers melted, rivers swelled, and the seas began to rise. At first, the transformation was gentle, imperceptible across the span of a single life. A fisherman might notice the shoreline creeping closer. A village elder might remark that the forest seemed wetter than before. But year after year, tide after tide, the waters came. By the time centuries had passed, the ocean had swallowed not just coasts, but whole valleys. The world that had once been vast and familiar was breaking apart. This was not a single flood, sudden and catastrophic, but a series of drownings spread across thousands of years. Yet to the tribes who lived through it, the distinction hardly mattered. For them, the land was vanishing. The rivers where they had fished, the plains where they had hunted, the caves where they had buried their dead, all disappeared beneath waves. Their maps were not of paper or stone, but of memory and myth, and those maps were being erased. Science tells us that sea levels rose by as much as 120 meters between the height of the Ice Age and the dawn of civilization. Entire continents, Sundaland, Doggerland, Beringia, were lost to this rising tide. The very shape of the earth shifted, sculpting the coastlines we know today. It was the greatest flood in human history, not a single event, but a global transformation. To imagine it is to imagine dislocation on a scale that strains comprehension. Picture an elder leading children through a forest path, only to find years later that the same path ends in water. Imagine villages abandoning ancestral homes, carrying fire from hearths to light new fires elsewhere, always retreating, always adapting. Imagine watching sacred hills become islands, isolated from the mainland, their significance deepened by distance. The emotional weight of this slow catastrophe must have been immense. Loss was not a single tragedy, but a constant companion. Each generation inherited a shrinking world. Each child grew up with the knowledge that what their parents called home might vanish in their lifetime. Stories of floods, of wrathful waters, of gods who drowned worlds, these were not mere myths. They were ways of making sense of a reality both devastating and undeniable. Around the world, echoes of this memory survive. In Mesopotamia, tales of a great flood became the foundation for epic stories carried into the legend of Noah. In India, the god Vishnu warns a man of rising waters, guiding him to safety. In Oceania, chants tell of islands swallowed by the sea. And in Southeast Asia, whispers of a drowned land linger still. Across cultures separated by oceans, humanity preserved the same theme, a flood that reshaped the world. But these were not only stories of destruction, they were also stories of survival. Flood myths often end not with annihilation, but with renewal. The floodwaters recede. Life continues. Humanity adapts. Beneath the grief lies resilience. For the people of the lost continents, survival meant migration. Families traveled inland, away from the advancing seas. Others took to the water, crafting boats from hollowed logs, learning to navigate rivers and coasts. The ocean, once feared as the force that devoured their land, became the pathway to new worlds. The flood was both an ending and a beginning. Modern science confirms the drama of this transformation. Core samples from seabeds reveal layers of sand and soil, markers of ancient floods. Fossilized tree stumps lie beneath shallow seas, remnants of forests drowned in place. Archaeologists find stone tools and animal bones deep underwater, evidence of lives interrupted by rising tides. The past is there, sealed beneath waves, waiting to be uncovered. And yet the most haunting evidence may not lie in artifacts, but in memory itself. Oral traditions have carried these stories for thousands of years, across hundreds of generations. Anthropologists studying indigenous tales in Australia, for example, discovered stories of rising seas that matched geological events more than 7,000 years old. Human memory, carried in myth, can outlast even continents. The flood that swallowed worlds was not merely an environmental shift, it was a crucible that shaped who we are. It forced humanity to adapt, to innovate, to move beyond the familiar. It scattered tribes, spread languages, and seeded cultures across continents. In the face of overwhelming change, humans did not vanish. They transformed. There is something profoundly humbling in this realization. The seas that now lap gently at our shores were once walls of loss to our ancestors. What we take as permanent, land, coast, horizon, was revealed to them as fragile, temporary, fleeting. Their world collapsed, yet they endured. Perhaps this is why the flood myths resonate so deeply. They remind us not only of the fragility of the earth, but also of the resilience of humanity. We are a species born of change, shaped by loss, and defined by our ability to begin again. The drowned valleys of Sundaland, the sunken plains of Doggerland, the submerged bridges of Beringia, all were tragedies, but also catalysts. Without them, the human journey might never have spread so far, nor adapted so deeply. The flood that swallowed worlds was not just a natural event. It was the stage upon which the human spirit proved itself. To this day, we carry its memory, not only in myths, but in the very shape of our world. Every coastline, every island, every sea is a reminder that the earth is never still, and neither are we. There was a time when Asia and the Americas were not separate worlds. Between Siberia and Alaska, where today the Bering Strait churns with icy waters, there once stretched a vast expanse of land, Beringia. A bridge not of stone, but of earth and tundra, linking continents for tens of thousands of years. It was not a narrow crossing, but a whole world of its own, a plain of grasses, rivers, and herds stretching hundreds of kilometers wide. This land was born of ice. During the Ice Age, so much water was locked in glaciers that sea levels dropped, exposing the continental shelves. What the ocean claimed today, it once relinquished. Where waves now roar, mammoths once grazed. Where walrus and whales now swim, humans once walk. For the first peoples who entered this land, Beringia must have felt like an endless horizon. The sky stretched low and gray. The ground was firm but frozen, softened only in summer when wildflowers pushed through the permafrost. Herds of steppe bison roamed in clusters. Woolly mammoths moved in slow, deliberate rhythms, carving paths across the plain. Saber-toothed cats and dire wolves followed shadows in pursuit. And in the midst of this, scattered bands of humans carried their fire, their tools, their stories from one world to the next. Crossing Beringia was not a single journey, but a way of life. Some groups lingered for generations, finding food in the rivers and hunting game on the open plain. Others moved steadily eastward, compelled by hunger, curiosity, or necessity. They followed herds, traced riverbanks, and watched the rising sun on horizons unknown. For them, this was not just migration, it was discovery. The science behind this migration has been pieced together through fragments, stone tools scattered in Alaskan soils, genetic traces in indigenous peoples of the Americas, and ice core records that reveal when Beringia stood above the sea. Together, they tell a story of resilience. The crossing may have begun more than 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets locked water away and the land bridge widened. For thousands of years, it remained open, a frozen thoroughfare between worlds. And yet, this was no simple path. To cross Beringia was to face extremes. Winters plunged into darkness, with temperatures dropping far below freezing. Winds scoured the plain, stripping warmth from skin. Summer brought light without end, but also swarms of insects that tormented both humans and animals alike. Survival required not just endurance, but innovation. Clothing of furs and hides, spears tipped with flint, fire carried carefully from camp to camp. In this crucible of extremes, humanity proved its adaptability once again. The migration across Beringia reshaped the human story. As bands moved eastward, they entered a continent untouched by human presence. They encountered animals unlike any they had seen before, giant ground sloths, armored glyptodons, towering short-faced bears. To step into the Americas was to step into an untouched wilderness, one that would challenge and inspire every skill they possessed. But before they entered this new world, they lingered in Beringia itself. Archaeologists believe that some groups remained in this region for thousands of years, isolated between the massive ice sheets that covered Canada and the seas that barred their retreat. This Beringian standstill, as it is called, may have lasted long enough for unique cultures, languages, and traditions to form. In that frozen pause, humanity was held in suspension, waiting for the ice to part. When the glaciers finally retreated, passages opened. The people of Beringia spread southward into the heart of the Americas. From Alaska to the Andes, from the Great Plains to Patagonia, their descendants carried not only tools and fire, but also memory, the memory of a land that once connected worlds. Beringia is gone now, drowned beneath the rising seas that ended the Ice Age. What remains is only fragments, bones buried in permafrost, artifacts beneath the waves, genetic echoes in the living. But to imagine Beringia is to imagine the moment when humanity expanded its boundaries beyond anything it had known. It was not merely a land bridge. It was the threshold of a new world. There is also something profoundly symbolic in this lost continent. It reminds us that borders are not fixed, that oceans and continents are not eternal. What seems permanent today, the separation of Asia and the Americas, was once an illusion. The earth is in motion, its face ever-changing, and humanity, small as it is, moves with it. For the tribes who once stood on Beringia's plain, the land beneath their feet was not a bridge at all. It was home. They hunted, they gathered, they sang, they grieved, they celebrated. To them, it was not a passageway but a living world. And when it disappeared, drowned by the returning sea, it vanished like so many other homelands, remembered only in the migrations it made possible. Perhaps this is why the story of Beringia resonates so strongly. It is the story of courage in the face of distance, of people who left behind the known for the unknown, of a threshold that, once crossed, would change the destiny of humankind. Every village, every city, every civilization that rose in the Americas traces its lineage back to those first steps on the tundra plain. When we look at the map today, with Alaska and Siberia separated by a ribbon of water, it is tempting to think of them as always divided. But to close your eyes and imagine Beringia is to remember that our world was once wider, stranger, and more connected than we realize. And that, in the end, we are a species defined not by the lands we lose, but by the horizons we dare to cross. There was once a continent beneath the waters of Southeast Asia, a place now hidden beneath the Java Sea, the South China Sea, and the Strait of Malacca. Today, we know it only as fragments: Sumatra, Borneo, Java, the Malay Peninsula, and countless islands scattered like emerald beads. But in the age of ice, they were not islands at all. They were one. Together, they formed Sundaland, a vast tropical continent that connected lands and peoples for tens of thousands of years. To imagine Sundaland is to step into a forgotten rainforest. Great rivers cut across its lowlands, draining from high mountains and spreading into fertile floodplains. Towering trees rose in endless canopies, their leaves trembling with the cries of birds, the calls of monkeys, the rustle of reptiles. Elephants and rhinoceroses wandered in herds. Tigers padded softly through the underbrush. And scattered within this living cathedral of green, humans found refuge, carving out lives in harmony with a land as abundant as it was mysterious. Unlike the stark tundras of Beringia, Sundaland was warm, wet, and fertile. Here, early humans did not follow herds across frozen plains. Instead, they moved through forests, rivers, and mangrove swamps, gathering fruits, roots, and shellfish, fishing in the estuaries and hunting small game. It was a land of plenty, but also a land of challenge. The rainforest, with its thick growth and hidden predators, demanded cunning and adaptability. Tools had to be fashioned for climbing, digging, cutting, and weaving. And in this crucible of abundance and danger, cultures blossom. Archaeological traces show that humans lived across Sundaland for tens of thousands of years. Stone tools, cave paintings, and ancient hearths tell of long continuity. Genetic studies suggest that some of the peoples who later spread into the Pacific and even into Australia may have roots here, carrying fragments of Sundaland's legacy across oceans. In many ways, it was a hidden nursery of humanity, a place where languages, myths, and traditions were shaped under the shadows of great trees and across the shores of vanished rivers. But Sundaland was not to last. Its fate was written in the ice. As the glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, the seas began to rise. Slowly at first, then with terrible speed, the ocean crept inland. Rivers became estuaries. Valleys became bays. Mountains became islands. Year after year, generation after generation, the waters swallowed the land. What had been a continent became an archipelago. For the people who lived here, the flooding was not a distant abstraction. It was their world collapsing around them. Villages once far inland found themselves at the edge of the tide. Hunting grounds vanished. Sacred sites disappeared beneath the waves. Forests drowned, leaving only the tops of trees rising from saltwater swamps. Every generation would have carried memories of a shoreline that no longer existed. Every story passed down must have held echoes of loss. Some archaeologists believe this long drowning may have given rise to flood myths that echo through Asia and beyond. Tales of great waters that swallowed lands, of gods who punished or renewed the world, of survivors who carried memory across generations. Perhaps the stories of a global flood, found in traditions from Mesopotamia to India to Polynesia, have roots in the real lived experience of places like Sundaland, a collective human memory of watching the sea take the land. And yet, loss was not the end. Humans adapted, as they always have. As the waters rose, Sundaland's peoples took to the coasts, mastering fishing, sailing, and island navigation. Some became the ancestors of the Austronesian voyagers who would one day carry their seafaring skills across the Pacific, reaching as far as Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. In this way, Sundaland did not vanish entirely. It lived on in the voyages, languages, and traditions of those who carried its spirit across the waves. There is something haunting about this drowned continent. It reminds us how fragile our worlds can be. A land so vast, so rich, so full of life, gone in what was, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. Beneath the seas of Southeast Asia lie the forests, rivers, and valleys where humans once walked. Today, fishermen sometimes pull ancient wood or bones from the seabed, fragments of a world drowned but not erased. To think of Sundaland is to think of impermanence. Continents themselves are not eternal. The maps we draw, the borders we defend, the homelands we cherish, all can be undone by forces greater than us. The ocean is patient. It rises, it falls, it reclaims. Sundaland teaches us that what we call land is only borrowed from the sea. And yet, there is also beauty in this story. Because Sundaland's drowning did not mark the end of its people, but their transformation. Faced with vanishing land, they turned to the ocean. Where the forest fell silent, the sea sang new songs. Where rivers were lost, canoes carved new pathways. Sundaland became not a prison of memory, but a gateway to expansion. From drowned roots, humanity spread its branches further than ever before. Perhaps this is why the memory of Sundaland lingers in the imagination. It is not just about a lost land. It is about resilience, about the way humans can lose everything they know and still find a way forward. Beneath the waters of Southeast Asia lies a reminder of both fragility and strength. Fragility in the face of nature's power, strength in the face of inevitable change. The drowned heart of Asia may never rise again, but in a way, it still lives, within the forests of Borneo, the myths of Indonesia, the voyages of Polynesia, and the enduring truth that no land, however vast, lasts forever. Sundaland is gone, but its story flows onward like a river beneath the sea, carrying echoes of the people who once called it home. In the Bay of Bengal, far from the crowded coastlines of India and Myanmar, lies a chain of emerald islands. Small, rugged, wrapped in rainforest, and fringed by turquoise waters, they are the Andaman Islands. Today, they are often thought of as remote, even isolated. Yet, in the story of humanity, they are not marginal. They are a threshold, a place where land and sea, memory and survival, past and present intersect. For tens of thousands of years, humans have lived here. Long before modern nations mapped them, long before colonial ships arrived, long before even the great civilizations of Asia rose and fell, the Andamans were home. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that some of the peoples who settled here may descend from the earliest waves of modern humans to leave Africa. In their faces, languages, and traditions, scientists glimpse echoes of journeys that stretch back more than 50,000 years. The islands themselves are shaped by isolation. Dense rainforests cover the hills, alive with parrots, hornbills, and monkeys. Mangrove swamps line the coasts, where crocodiles slip silently through brackish water. Coral reefs spread like living gardens beneath the waves. For early humans, this was a land of both promise and challenge. Food could be found in abundance: fish, shellfish, fruits, and game. Yet, the sea cut them off from larger continents. Survival here meant adapting to a smaller world, an island world. The Andamanese tribes became masters of their environment. They built dugout canoes, hunted with bows and arrows, and gathered from the forest with deep knowledge of plants and animals. Their tools were simple but effective, shaped not by abundance of resources, but by necessity. In the forest, silence was skill, patience was survival. Along the coasts, timing meant everything, knowing when the tides would retreat, when the fish would run, when storms would come. Unlike the shifting, drowned expanses of Sundaland, the Andamans preserved continuity. While continents changed, while seas swallowed valleys and revealed new coastlines, life here carried on in rhythms that were remarkably stable. That stability left traces not only in tools and traditions, but in memory. Oral histories among the tribes sometimes speak of events thousands of years old. Geologists have even noted that certain flood myths align with evidence of ancient tsunamis and sea level changes. In this way, the Andamans are more than islands, they are archives of living memory, carried in song, story, and survival. But they are also a mirror held up to the deep past of all humanity. Anthropologists studying the Andamanese noticed practices and lifeways that may resemble those of our earliest ancestors: small hunter-gatherer groups, egalitarian social structures, deep respect for nature. It is not that these people are frozen in time, for no culture ever truly is. But their persistence in this environment shows us what endurance looks like when the world around you changes, yet you remain. The arrival of outsiders was disruptive. Colonial explorers in the 19th century described the Andamanese as hostile, for they often resisted contact with arrows and spears. Yet, from their perspective, this hostility was not cruelty, it was defense. Defense of land, of memory, of ways of life honed over thousands of years. In many ways, their response was an echo of what countless ancient tribes must have felt when confronted by strangers: fear, suspicion, but also a determination to hold on to what was theirs. Even today, there remain groups within the Andamans who reject outside contact almost entirely, choosing isolation over assimilation. Among them, the Sentinelese are perhaps the most well-known. Living on North Sentinel Island, they continue a way of life that has endured for millennia. Boats that approach are met with arrows. Attempts at forced contact have failed. The Indian government now enforces their isolation, recognizing that their survival depends on being left alone. They are, in a sense, a living reminder of prehistory, a community still walking a path most of humanity left behind tens of thousands of years ago. The Andaman threshold is important not just for what it reveals about the past, but for what it asks of us in the present. It challenges us to reconsider progress, to see value not only in cities, monuments, and technology, but also in continuity, in endurance, in the ability of a small group of people to live sustainably in one place for thousands upon thousands of years. Philosophically, the Andamans force us to ask, what does it mean to be modern? Must all peoples follow the same arc of agriculture, civilization, and industrialization? Or is there wisdom in other paths, paths that are older, quieter, less visible, yet no less human? In a time when global cultures are becoming ever more uniform, the Andaman tribes stand as proof that diversity of ways is not only possible, but profoundly valuable. Standing on the shores of these islands today, one might see waves breaking against coral, hear the cries of parrots in the canopy, feel the humid air thick with the scent of earth and salt. It is easy to imagine the generations who stood here before, watching the horizon, waiting for fish, whispering stories into the firelight. Their world was small, but it was complete. A threshold world holding on to the memory of humanity's earliest migrations while also pointing forward to the resilience that would carry us further. The Andaman threshold reminds us that not all of humanity's story is buried in stone or drowned beneath the sea. Some of it still breathes, still sings, still hunts and gathers beneath the canopy. To know these islands is to know not just a place, but a continuity that stretches back to the dawn of our species. In their resilience, we find memory. In their isolation, we glimpse connection. In their survival, we are reminded that the first tribes are not entirely lost. Some still live, still endure, still carry the memory of beginnings across the waters of the Bay of Bengal. There is a narrow strait where two continents almost touch, where the rugged cliffs of East Africa lean toward the arid coasts of Arabia. Today, it is called the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears. For sailors in later centuries, the name evoked the dangers of crossing, shifting currents, fierce winds, and treacherous waters. But for humanity, tens of thousands of years ago, this gate was something else entirely. It was a threshold, a point of passage, a doorway from the familiar world of Africa into the unknown expanse of Eurasia. Archaeologists believe that somewhere near this strait, perhaps 70,000 years ago, some of the first groups of modern humans crossed from Africa into Arabia. They did not yet know the deserts that stretched ahead, nor the mountains, nor the green refuges hidden in valleys. What they did know was the sea, and how to move across it. Whether on rafts of bundled reeds, dugout canoes, or even simple flotation aids fashioned from logs, these crossings were feats of courage. Imagine a small band of perhaps 20 or 30 people, loading what little they had, stone tools, children, fire carried in embers, into crude vessels and setting out across a narrow but unpredictable body of water. The horizon ahead was uncertain, but the drive to explore, to move, to seek new lands, carried them forward. The Arabian Peninsula they entered was not exactly the desert wasteland it is today. Climate shifts had made parts of it greener. Lakes shimmered in what are now barren basins. Rivers carved valleys across landscapes now dry and cracked. Archaeological digs have uncovered ancient tools around these long-vanished lakes, proof that early humans not only passed through Arabia but sometimes lingered, adapting to its shifting climates. For a time, this land of dunes and mountains became a stepping stone, a staging ground for further expansion. But life here was fragile. Periods of drought returned, lakes dried, and grasslands shrank. Some groups may have perished, their stories lost to the silence of the desert. Others moved on, following coastlines toward the Persian Gulf, Oman, and beyond. The Arabian Gate was not a final destination, it was a corridor, a bottleneck through which countless generations flowed, some vanishing, others pressing forward. In the caves of Jebel Faya, in the United Arab Emirates, archaeologists uncovered stone tools strikingly similar to those used in East Africa. They suggest that early humans brought their technology with them, adapting it slowly as new materials were found. Nearby, in Dhofar, Oman, ancient stone scatters show evidence of human activity stretching back tens of millennia. These sites are fragile fingerprints of migration, tiny markers left in a vast and shifting wilderness. The Arabian Gate was not just about geography, it was about psychology. To cross that narrow strait was to embrace uncertainty. Behind lay the familiar grasslands of Africa, the great rift valleys, the rivers and animals that had shaped humanity's early evolution. Ahead lay the unknown, strange plants, new animals, unfamiliar skies. To walk through the Arabian deserts was to feel small against horizons that stretched endlessly, to confront thirst, hunger, and fear. Yet, it was also to feel possibility, new hunting grounds, new shelters, new stories waiting to be told. The crossing itself was likely not a single event. It happened again and again, over thousands of years. Small groups trickling across, some staying, others moving on. Perhaps families returned to Africa after failed attempts. Perhaps children born on Arabian soil were among the first to know what it meant to belong to two worlds at once. In this sense, the Arabian Gate was not only a threshold of migration but also of identity. Humanity was beginning to become global, to exist in more than one homeland at a time. From a wider perspective, the Arabian Gate was the hinge of human destiny. It was here that the species' path forked. Those who stayed in Africa continued their own rich histories, while those who crossed laid the foundations for the settlement of Asia, Europe, and beyond. Every later culture outside Africa, every city, every language, every story, is, in some sense, a branch that grew from the seed planted at this crossing. Philosophically, the Gate of Tears carries an enduring symbolism. It reminds us that progress often requires risk, that survival sometimes demands stepping into the unknown. It also reflects the duality of fear and hope that defines the human journey. The same waters that could drown you were also the waters that carried you forward. The same deserts that could starve you also offered pathways to new lands. In every shadow lay danger, but also opportunity. Even today, standing at Bab el-Mandeb, one can feel the pull of history. Cargo ships glide through its narrow passage, oil tankers churn the water, and fishermen cast nets from small boats. Yet, beneath all this modern activity, lingers the ghost of that first crossing. Somewhere under these same waves, long ago, the paddles of the first voyagers dipped and pulled, carrying humanity across the threshold. Their footprints may be gone, erased by time, but their choice echoes in every corner of the globe. The Arabian Gate was humanity's first great leap into the wider world. From here, the trail would scatter, into Persia, into India, into the highlands of Central Asia, into the forests of Southeast Asia. The world was vast, and the path ahead uncertain. But it had begun. The threshold had been crossed. In that crossing, humanity ceased to be bound to one continent. It became a species of horizons, a species of movement, a species forever reaching for what lies beyond. The Gate of Tears was, in truth, the Gate of Beginnings. The Zagros Mountains rise like a vast wall across western Iran, their jagged peaks shadowed in mists, their valleys deep and secluded. To early human groups who arrived here tens of thousands of years ago, this was both a sanctuary and a test. The mountains offered caves for shelter, rivers for water, and herds of wild goats and gazelles moving along the ridges. But they also demanded resilience. Winters brought heavy snows, summers baked the valleys, and predators lurked in the forests and ravines. It was here, among the steep ridgelines and flickering campfires, that some of the earliest mountain tribes took root. Archaeological evidence suggests that by around 40,000 years ago, humans were not only passing through the Zagros, but beginning to settle in its caves. Shanidar Cave, one of the most famous sites, has yielded both Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens remains. These bones tell stories of coexistence, of possible encounters between two species in a land where survival was always uncertain. In one grave, flowers were found, leading some researchers to believe Neanderthals may have buried their dead with rituals, an echo of symbolic thought that mirrors our own. For the tribes of the Zagros, fire was the great unifier. In caves, firelight cast dancing shadows across rough stone walls, creating the first theaters of imagination. Around flames, people cooked meat, warmed themselves, and told stories. Fire allowed them to endure harsh winters and gave courage against prowling beasts. To sit around fire in the mountains was to transform wilderness into home, fear into familiarity. Perhaps it was in these highlands that fire took on its earliest spiritual dimensions, not just a tool, but a presence, a force that bound the tribe together. Hunting in the Zagros demanded strategy. The steep terrain meant that game animals could vanish quickly into hidden valleys. Early tribes likely worked together, driving herds toward natural traps, using stone-tipped spears and coordinated shouts. The cooperative nature of such hunts strengthened bonds. Food was survival, but it was also trust that the group would share the kill, trust that no one would be abandoned. These were the roots of culture, forming not only through tools and art, but through the invisible fabric of community. The mountains also shaped imagination. High peaks inspired awe, their summits hidden by clouds, their vastness dwarfing the human form. To look up at the ridges was to feel small, to sense forces greater than oneself. Perhaps the first myths of skydwellers, mountain spirits, or gods began here, born from the sheer scale of the landscape. In the Zagros, humans were reminded daily of their fragility, but also of their endurance. To survive the mountains was to prove resilience against the weight of the world. Shanidar also preserves stories of compassion. One skeleton showed signs of a man who had been injured severely, one arm missing, his eye damaged, his body crippled by trauma. Yet he had lived for years after his injury. This suggests that others in the tribe had cared for him, fed him, and ensured he survived. It is a profound reminder that humanity's story was never only about competition or survival of the fittest. It was also about empathy, about choosing to protect those who could not protect themselves. In the cold shadows of the mountains, firelight was not only warmth, but kindness. Philosophically, the Zagros tribes show us the duality of beginnings. They lived in a place both nurturing and unforgiving, where abundance and scarcity alternated like seasons. To exist here required both courage and humility. It meant acknowledging the limits of human strength, while also pushing those limits. The mountains demanded patience, teaching that survival is not a sprint, but a cycle tied to the rhythms of snowmelt, migration, and growth. The Zagros also sat at a crossroads of worlds. To the west lay Mesopotamia's fertile plains, to the east the Iranian plateau, to the south the deserts leading toward the Gulf. Over tens of millennia, tribes would pass through, settle, and move on, leaving faint traces, charcoal, tools, bones, like whispers carried by the wind. Some would merge, others vanish. The mountains were never conquered, only negotiated with, and in this negotiation, humanity learned humility. To imagine a night in the Zagros is to picture a small fire burning in a cave mouth, sparks drifting into the cold air. A child sleeps beside their mother, while hunters whisper plans for the next day. Above, stars blaze sharp and clear, unpolluted by any modern light. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves howl, their voices echoing against the ridges. And yet, inside the cave, there is safety, warmth, and belonging. In such moments, the foundations of identity deepened. Tribe was no longer just blood, it was those who sat with you at the fire, those who guarded your sleep. From the perspective of the human journey, the Zagros represents an early step toward permanence. While migrations carried people across deserts and coasts, the mountains encouraged lingering, building traditions tied to place. These were not yet villages or farms, but they were beginnings of rootedness. To return year after year to the same cave, the same hunting grounds, was to form a relationship with the land. The Zagros was not only a stage, it was a partner in humanity's unfolding story. In time, the mountains would nurture some of the earliest agricultural societies, thousands of years after these first tribes. But even in the deep prehistoric past, they were shaping the mental landscapes of humans, teaching cooperation, compassion, reverence, and resilience. The fires that burned in Zagros caves were more than survival flames. They were sparks of culture carried forward into every valley, every plain, every future civilization. And so, the Zagros mountains stand not only as stone and snow, but as memory. Memory of a time when humanity was still young, when the world was vast and mysterious, when survival was both a daily struggle and a profound act of unity. In their caves, by their rivers, beneath their peaks, our ancestors began to understand themselves not merely as wanderers, but as communities bound by story, by ritual, by fire. The Zagros was a crucible, and from it, humanity emerged tempered, ready for the greater journey still to come. The rivers of ancient Persia cut through arid lands like veins of life, silver threads glinting beneath the sun. Long before great empires carved their names upon the region, these rivers nourished the first settlers who dared to linger beside their shifting banks. To follow a river was to follow survival itself. It was water for thirst, fish for food, reeds for shelter, and a guide through otherwise unyielding landscapes. For tribes accustomed to migration, rivers were the first hints of permanence, the places that beckoned them to return again and again. Among the most important of these waterways was the Karun River, winding down from the Zagros Mountains, spilling across fertile plains before reaching the Gulf. Its shifting currents carried stories of both danger and promise. To early humans, rivers were unpredictable. Floods could sweep away camps, droughts could starve the land. Yet, even in their volatility, rivers offered a rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of survival. The settlers who gathered near these waters learned to read their moods, watching the sky, studying the earth, listening to the sound of flow. Life along the Persian rivers was unlike life in the highlands. Here, the land flattened into wide floodplains, where rich soils deposited by seasonal floods nourished wild grasses and plants. Game animals came to drink at the banks, gazelles, wild cattle, boars. Birds flocked in great numbers, their wings flashing in the dawn light. For tribes that had wandered through deserts and mountains, the abundance must have seemed like a miracle. The rivers did not simply sustain life, they invited imagination. Perhaps, here, they thought, there could be a different way of living, not only hunting and wandering, but staying, planting, watching things grow. Archaeological traces suggest that some of the earliest experiments in plant use happened in these river valleys. Wild barley and wheat grew along the banks, their stalks shimmering gold in the breeze. At first, people gathered them as they did any other food. But slowly, with observation and patience, patterns emerged. Seeds scattered near campfires sprouted again in the next season. The land itself seemed to remember. For the first settlers, this must have felt like both discovery and mystery. The earth had its own memory, and humans could learn to work with it. The rivers were also highways of connection. Long before formal roads or caravans, rivers linked communities across vast distances. A raft made of reeds could carry goods, firewood, or food downstream. Along the way, groups met others, exchanged stories, and perhaps even rituals. In this way, rivers did not only shape survival, they shaped culture. To live by a river was to live in the presence of others, to know that you were part of a larger web of life stretching far beyond your own campfire. At night, the riverbanks became stages for the imagination. The sound of flowing water mixed with the crackle of fire, the chirps of insects, the distant calls of night animals. Reflections of flames danced across the current, turning darkness into shifting patterns of light. Children fell asleep to the sound of stories, elders spoke of origins and spirits, and hunters sharpened tools for the next day. In these moments, the river was more than a resource, it was a companion, a voice whispering endlessly, reminding humanity of continuity. The rivers also taught lessons of caution. Too much trust in their abundance could lead to disaster. Floodwaters rose without warning, carving away soil and drowning low-lying camps. Crocodiles lurked in still pools, snakes slipped silently through reeds, and disease bred in stagnant water. To live with a river meant to respect it, to acknowledge its duality. It was a life-giver and a destroyer, both generous and merciless. Humanity's relationship with rivers was never one of mastery, it was one of negotiation, a fragile truce between need and fear. Philosophically, rivers marked a turning point in the human journey. In mountains and deserts, survival was episodic: hunt, move, adapt, repeat. By rivers, survival became cyclical. The seasons turned, floods came and went, plants grew and withered, animals returned along predictable paths. Time itself began to feel different. Humans learned to wait, to anticipate, to plan. Patience became a survival skill, and with patience came reflection. Life was no longer just about immediate needs, it was about imagining the future. The first settlers of the Persian rivers left behind clues of this shift. Hearths were built and rebuilt in the same places. Tools became more specialized, adapted for cutting plants as well as skinning animals. Burial sites suggest repeated use of particular grounds, an early sign of rootedness to place. These were not yet cities or farms, but they were seeds of stability, germinating quietly along the banks of rivers. Imagine standing by the Karun River in those ancient days. The sun sets, painting the sky in copper and violet. The river reflects the fading light, its surface rippling like liquid glass. A small group tends to fish traps, while others gather reeds for sleeping mats. Children splash in the shallows, laughing, their voices carried away by the current. In the distance, the mountains rise like shadows, reminders of harsher lands left behind. And yet, here by the river, there is a sense of possibility, something new taking shape, fragile but enduring. The rivers of Persia would later cradle some of humanity's first true settlements, paving the way toward agriculture, writing, and civilization. But even in the deep prehistoric past, they were already sculpting the human mind, teaching us to slow down, to observe, to live not only from hand to mouth but from season to season. These waters were lifelines, but they were also teachers, shaping the very rhythm of thought. In time, the rivers would be worshipped, their flows honored with rituals and offerings. They would become symbols of continuity, of the eternal cycle of life and death. But in their earliest days, to the first tribes who camped along their banks, they were something simpler and perhaps more profound: a reason to stay, a reason to gather, a reason to dream. Thus, along the Persian rivers, the human journey took a quiet but monumental step. From wandering hunter to watchful settler, from immediate survival to patient observation, from fleeting presence to enduring relationship with the land. The rivers flowed, and with them, humanity began to flow too, not just across geography, but across time, toward the dawn of civilization itself. Where the rivers of Persia reached their end, they spilled into a shallow, sunlit sea, the ancient Gulf, a place of convergence where fresh water mingled with salt and land dissolved into endless horizons. This was no ordinary coast. Here, in prehistory, the Gulf was not the arid, hot basin we see today. During the Ice Age, much of Earth's water was locked in glaciers, and sea levels were far lower. What is now a stretch of ocean had once been fertile land, a drowned plain where rivers braided together into a vast green delta. Some scholars call it the Garden of the Gulf, a place that may have been one of humanity's earliest cradles of settlement. For the first tribes arriving at this shore, the Gulf was a meeting ground of worlds. The rivers brought soil, nutrients, and freshwater fish. The tidal flats offered shellfish and crabs, while the open sea teemed with larger catches for those brave enough to venture outward. The air smelled of salt and reeds, and the horizon shimmered with heat by day, then stretched endlessly under stars at night. To stand here was to be caught between opposites, land and sea, permanence and flux, the known and the unknown. The Gulf's fertility came from its unique geography. Seasonal floods from inland rivers carried sediments rich in minerals, spreading them across the plains before the waters receded. This left behind soil, dark and soft, capable of nurturing grasses, shrubs, and even early wild grains. Herds of animals roamed the wetlands, and flocks of migratory birds darkened the skies during seasonal passages. For early humans, this was abundance like few places on Earth could provide. Food sources overlapped: fish, shellfish, birds, animals, plants, all within reach. It was quite literally a convergence of sustenance. But the Gulf was more than a pantry. It was a crossroads of movement and culture. The rivers acted as inland highways, bringing groups from deep within the continent to its shores. The sea, meanwhile, tempted them outward, across waters to other lands, unseen but imaginable. This was one of the earliest places where humans may have contemplated seafaring. To carve a boat from reeds or wood, to push into the surf, to trust in waves, this was not just a practical act but a leap into mystery. The Gulf was where courage met curiosity, where survival extended its hand toward exploration. The tribes who lived here likely developed unique skills: fishing with woven nets, building rafts or canoes, storing food in clay-lined pits, weaving mats from reeds. The abundance allowed for experimentation, and with experimentation came innovation. Some archaeologists propose that these floodplains may have been among the first places where people began to gather plants intentionally, scattering seeds, watching them sprout. If so, the Gulf was not merely fertile in soil, but fertile in ideas. As abundance grew, so too did the possibility of staying. Camps became semi-permanent. Hearths were built not only for warmth, but for cooking diverse meals. Tools became more varied, adapted to fishing, grinding, and weaving. The Gulf gave people time, and with time came stories. Around fires, beneath endless skies, myths would have been born, stories of waters that never ended, of creatures hidden beneath waves, of the moon that pulled the tides. The Gulf was not only a place to live, it was a place to imagine. But the Gulf also carried a secret. The waters were rising. As the Ice Age gave way to a warming world, glaciers melted, seas crept higher, and the fertile plains began to drown. What had once been meadows and wetlands became tidal flats, then shallow lagoons, then open sea. Generations watched as their land disappeared. Villages were forced to retreat inland, abandoning the places where ancestors were buried, where stories were rooted. The Gulf was both a giver and a taker, offering life and then reclaiming it in waves. For those who lived through this transformation, it must have felt like the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. Rivers that once emptied into wide valleys now poured directly into saltwater. Hunting grounds vanished, replaced by marshes too deep to cross. Sacred spaces were swallowed, leaving only memories. Yet, out of this upheaval came resilience. Humans learned to adapt, not just to land, but to change itself. The Gulf became a lesson in impermanence, in the necessity of movement, even when roots had begun to take hold. Some researchers believe that echoes of this drowned land may live on in humanity's oldest myths. Flood stories appear in cultures across the world, from Mesopotamia to India, from the Bible to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Could these tales be faint memories, carried down through oral tradition, of a time when fertile plains vanished beneath the sea? If so, then the Gulf was not only a place of survival, but a birthplace of myth, a stage for humanity's first reflections on loss and continuity. Imagine standing on that ancient shore as waters slowly rose. The tide creeps higher each year, covering what had once been campsites. Reeds vanish beneath the surface, fish pools turn brackish, graves become unreachable. A child points to the horizon and asks, "Where has our land gone?" The elders have no answer. Only the sea speaks, whispering endlessly, its voice both soothing and merciless. For the tribes, the Gulf was no longer just fertile, it was alive, a force that shaped destiny itself. Yet even in loss, the Gulf gave something enduring. It pushed humanity outward. As land drowned, groups followed the rivers inland or pushed across the waves, seeking new coasts. In this way, the Gulf may have been a springboard for migration, sending people further east toward the Indus and beyond, or westward toward Mesopotamia. The convergence of rivers and sea did not end with drowning, it expanded the horizons of humanity. Thus, the fertile Gulf stands in history not only as a lost landscape, but as a turning point. It was where tribes first tasted abundance, where they first dreamed of boats and journeys, where they first experienced the pain of loss on a geological scale. It was where permanence and impermanence collided, teaching humans that nothing, no land, no abundance, no security, lasts forever. And in that lesson, perhaps lies the very root of civilization, the ability to imagine continuity, even when the world itself is impermanent. The fertile Gulf was not simply a drowned plain. It was a mirror, showing humanity its own dual nature, resilient yet fragile, rooted yet restless, always adapting, always searching. Here, at the meeting of rivers and sea, the first tribes glimpsed both the richness of life and the inevitability of change. It was not just a cradle of settlement, it was a cradle of thought. In the beginning, there were only camps, circles of firelight flickering against the night, tents of hide or huts of reed, tools scattered on the earth. These were temporary places, made for seasons, abandoned when the game moved or the waters changed. But over generations, something subtle began to shift. The camps grew heavier, as if the people themselves were anchoring to the land. Fires burned in the same places. Paths appeared where bare feet walked daily. Graves were dug, and with them, the idea that the dead belonged to the soil beneath. Slowly, imperceptibly, the first camps became the first villages. The fertile Gulf plains and river valleys had given humans abundance. Food no longer demanded relentless wandering. Fish could be caught again and again from the same stream. Wild grain sprouted each year in familiar patches. Herd animals returned season after season to graze. It was as if the land itself encouraged people to stay. In this abundance, a quiet revolution unfolded, not of kings or empires, but of daily life. Imagine one such village. Huts clustered near a river bend, their walls woven of reeds, their roofs thatched with grass. Smoke curls upward from hearths, carrying the scent of roasting fish. Children chase one another along well-trodden paths, their laughter rising into the dusk. At the water's edge, women pound seeds with stone mortars, the rhythm steady, echoing like a heartbeat. Men mend nets, carve hooks, sharpen stone blades. Dogs bark at shadows, already partners in the human story. It is not yet a city, not even a town, but it is no longer only a camp. The shift from movement to settlement was not simply about food, it was about time. Camps are fleeting, they leave little behind. Villages, however, accumulate. A broken pot remains where it fell. Ash builds in the hearth. Footprints harden into paths. The past lingers. And when the past lingers, memory takes root. For the first time, humans began to live not only in space but in continuity. A village was not only where you lived, it was where your parents had lived and where your children might remain. With continuity came new forms of life. Pottery, once too fragile to carry on endless journeys, now became possible. Clay was shaped, hardened in fire, and left in houses that would not move. Storage pits appeared, dug deep to hold surplus grain or dried fish. Tools became specialized, grinding stones, sickles, weaving looms. The very rhythm of existence changed. No longer did the tribe follow herds endlessly. Instead, the seasons themselves became the rhythm, the planting, the harvest, the floods, the dry times. The earth had become the metronome of human life. But permanence was not without cost. Villages tied people to specific places, and with ties came both security and vulnerability. To stay meant to depend on the soil, the river, the harvest. Drought could now devastate. Floods could wash away homes. Disease, once dispersed by movement, could spread rapidly in crowded huts. The village was both sanctuary and risk. Yet, the people remained, drawn by the stability it promised. The hearth, once a circle of stones in the open air, became the beating heart of each household. Around it, families gathered to eat, to tell stories, to watch sparks rise like tiny stars into the roof beams. Fire no longer meant only warmth and protection. It meant home. And with home came identity. A person was not just of a tribe wandering the land, they were of a place, tied to a river, a plain, a shore. The village gave humans the first taste of belonging to something larger than themselves. And so, community deepened. Tasks were divided not only by skill or strength, but by need. Some became builders of huts, others skilled fishers, others keepers of seeds. Cooperation grew, for survival was now collective, woven into the fabric of the village. Disputes surely arose, for where people live together, conflicts follow. Yet, alongside conflict came resolution, the beginnings of custom, rule, and agreement. The seeds of law were planted in the soil of the first villages, not in palaces, but in conversations by the fire. What did it feel like to live in one of these first villages? Perhaps it felt safer, food more certain, the nights less lonely. Perhaps it felt heavier too, the weight of responsibility, of fields to tend, of stores to guard. There was joy in continuity, but also fear. What if the harvest failed? What if strangers came? The village was both a gift and a burden. Humanity was learning, for the first time, what it meant to root itself. Burial practices reveal this shift most poignantly. Nomadic camps often left the dead behind, marked only by stones or cairns. But villages buried their ancestors beneath floors or in graves nearby. To sleep each night above the bones of kin was to accept permanence. It tied people to the soil, not only through food, but through memory, through reverence. The village was no longer just a place for the living, it was a place where the living and the dead coexisted. Over time, these clusters of huts became the blueprints of civilization. Paths widened into communal spaces. Storage pits became granaries. The first communal buildings may have arisen, not temples yet, but shared shelters, meeting places, or structures for rituals. Humans were learning that to live together was not only about survival, but about meaning. The village was a seed, and within it lay the potential for everything to come: cities, temples, kingdoms, and myths. Yet, even in this moment of settling, the memory of movement lingered. Songs told of migrations, of lands left behind. Stories carried the memory of rivers crossed, plains wandered, stars followed. The village was new, but the soul of the tribe was still ancient. Perhaps this duality, the pull between movement and settlement, has never left humanity. We are creatures who long for home, yet dream of horizons. The first villages did not know they were shaping history. To their people, they were simply the place where the hut stood, where the river flowed, where food was gathered, where children grew. And yet, in their ordinary days, they were laying the foundation of everything. By staying, by building, by belonging, they turned survival into society. The first villages were more than collections of huts. They were the first echoes of permanence, the first experiments in rootedness, the first reflections of what it means to live not just for today, but for tomorrow. They were humanity's earliest homes, and from them, all of civilization would grow. If the village was the body of early human settlement, then fire, clay, and memory were its soul. They were not simply tools or materials, they were carriers of continuity. With them, people learned how to stretch the present into the future, how to make the fleeting durable, how to anchor their lives in permanence. Fire had been a companion since deep prehistory. It guarded the night, softened food, and kept predators at bay. But in the village, fire took on a new form. No longer a wandering flame carried from camp to camp, it became something sustained, an eternal ember kept alive in hearts that burned day after day. The fire of a household was not merely warmth, it was lineage. To let it die was unthinkable, for it meant breaking continuity. Children learned to feed it with kindling, as if tending to a living ancestor. Smoke rising from many huts marked not only survival but the heartbeat of community itself. And from fire came another revolution: clay transformed into pottery. Clay had always been underfoot, soft and formless, the mud of rivers and floodplains. But when shaped and placed into the embrace of flame, it hardened into vessels, durable, portable, enduring. For the first time, food could be stored safely beyond the day it was gathered. Grains could be kept through the winter. Water could be carried without leaking. The world of immediacy cracked open into the possibility of surplus. Imagine a woman kneeling by the riverbank, pressing her hands into wet clay. Her fingers trace a shape that has been shaped before: a round belly of a pot, a narrow neck, a lip for pouring. She decorates it with lines, zigzags, spirals, perhaps echoing rivers, mountains, or stars. Then she places it in the fire. As the flames consume the wood, the clay resists, hardens, and is reborn. When it cools, she holds something her great-grandmother could never have carried: a memory, hardened in earth and flame. Pottery was not only practical, it was cultural memory made tangible. Each pot bore marks of identity, patterns that told of families, symbols that whispered of myths, designs that mapped the unseen. Archaeologists today read these patterns as books of clay, tracing migrations, traditions, and beliefs through their motifs. To those who made them, they were more than containers of grain or water. They were containers of meaning, vessels of memory. Fire and clay intertwined with a third, more intangible tool, memory itself. For the first time, memory did not rely only on voices and stories, fleeting as air. Now, it could be inscribed in objects, in the patterns of pots, in the alignments of hearths, in the very arrangement of the village. Each artifact was a message sent forward in time, a fragment of identity made durable. Consider how this must have altered the rhythm of thought. Nomads remembered through songs and tales passed orally from elder to youth. But villagers could look upon the same vessel their grandmother had shaped. They could see her hands in the grooves of the clay. They could touch continuity. Time, once a rushing river, began to slow, to pool, to leave reflections. This deepened the sense of ancestry. Fire connected generations. What burned in the hearth today was the same flame lit by ancestors long gone. Clay preserved their touch, and memory, woven into ritual, ensured their presence lingered. The dead were not only buried beneath floors, they lived on in every object shaped by fire and hand. But with permanence also came new vulnerabilities. Fire, once protector, could now be destroyer. A single spark could consume the huts of an entire village. Clay, once storage, could shatter, scattering grain into the dust. Memory, once song, could be bound too tightly to objects. If the pot broke, if the pattern was forgotten, the thread of continuity could be lost. The very tools of permanence carried fragility. Humanity was learning that every gift had a shadow. Still, the balance leaned toward creation. Fire led to cooking methods that unlocked new nutrition, boiling plants, softening roots, stewing meats. Clay led to architecture, sun-dried bricks stacked into walls, ovens built to bake bread, altars rising toward the sacred. Memory led to ritual, the fire rekindled at dawn, the pot offered in burial, the story repeated word for word across generations. It is in these practices that the first stirrings of spirituality deepened. Fire became sacred, the eternal flame connecting worlds. Clay became offering, shaped and given to the earth or the gods. Memory became the soul of identity, the invisible thread linking the living with the unseen. Villages were not only shelters of the body, they became sanctuaries of meaning. Picture a twilight scene, the village quiet after the day's labor, shadows stretching long. In the center of one hut, a fire burns steady. Around it sit elders, children, families. An old man tells of the first ancestors, his voice crackling like the logs. A pot, painted with spirals, rests beside him, holding water drawn from the same river that sustained his grandparents. A child listens, eyes wide, tracing the pot's patterns with her finger. In her mind, the fire, the clay, and the story merge. She does not yet know it, but she is participating in humanity's oldest act, preserving memory through continuity. Through fire, clay, and memory, humans began to master not only the land but time itself. They learned to project themselves into the future, to ensure that what was gathered today could be eaten tomorrow, that what was remembered yesterday could be told again today. This mastery of continuity set the stage for everything that would follow. Without fire, there would be no metal. Without clay, no cities. Without memory, no history. The tools of continuity were not inventions in the sense of sudden genius. They were discoveries, born of patient hands, trial and error, mistakes and persistence. They were quiet revolutions, not battles. They did not change a single moment, but reshaped thousands of years. And perhaps that is why they endure. The world we live in today, of homes, containers, traditions, still rests on the foundation of fire, clay, and memory. When we light a candle, when we shape earth into form, when we tell a story to a child, we echo those first villagers. We continue their continuity. In their fragile huts, by rivers and plains, they did not know what civilizations would rise. But in their fires, their vessels, their memories, they carried the seeds of everything. At some point, perhaps around the fire, perhaps while gazing at the endless stars, humanity began to dream beyond the visible. The village was no longer just a place of bodies and tools, it became a place of spirits. The first myths arose not from books or temples, but from breath, flame, and silence. These myths were attempts to weave meaning from mystery, to bind the visible and the invisible into one living fabric. The people looked at the earth beneath their feet. It fed them with roots and grains, it shaped into clay, it received the bodies of their dead. Surely, they thought, the earth itself must be alive. Perhaps it was a great mother breathing beneath the soil, her heartbeat felt in the tremors of the ground, her tears flowing in the rivers. When seeds sprouted and grew into towering stalks, it was seen as her gift. When floods swept away huts, it was her anger or her sorrow. The ground was not inert, it was presence, power, personality. Then they lifted their eyes to the sky. At night, stars spilled across the heavens like sparks from an infinite fire. They moved in patterns, seasons, cycles, constellations. To the villagers, these lights were not random. They were eyes watching, ancestors guiding, spirits signaling. The moon waxed and waned, pulling tides and moods, marking time with a rhythm older than words. The sun rose each morning, golden and fierce, the eternal fire beyond all fires. It gave warmth, growth, and sight. Surely it too was alive, perhaps the greatest spirit of all. Between earth and sky stretched air and weather, the invisible forces that breathed life or devastation. Winds whispered like voices from another realm. Storms cracked the horizon with lightning, as if gods were striking stone against stone. Rain fell as blessing or punishment. To the people of the first villages, these were not natural events, but conversations with the unseen world. And so, the first myths took shape. They were not written, but spoken, sung, danced, painted on clay. They explained why rivers ran, why stars moved, why death came. They gave comfort where reason could not. They connected people to something larger than themselves. They allowed the fragile village to feel part of a vast, mysterious cosmos. Imagine a night in such a village. The fire burns low, embers glowing red. Children gather, their faces lit by flickering light. An elder begins a story of a time when the sky was close enough to touch, when people could climb ladders of smoke to speak with ancestors. Or of the first woman, shaped from clay, who gave birth to rivers and mountains. Or of the great bird who carried the sun across the sky each morning. The children listen, their eyes wide, their hearts trembling. These stories are not entertainment. They are truth, or something deeper than truth, mythic truth, woven from awe and necessity. Myth was also ritual. To thank the earth, people buried offerings of food or pots near fields. To honor the sky, they raised hands or lifted smoke upward. To calm storms, they sang. To speak to ancestors, they whispered at graves. These acts were not separate from survival, they were survival. For in honoring the spirits, people felt secure. They believed themselves participants in a cosmic balance, not merely prey to its chaos. Archaeology shows us traces of this awakening. Graves filled with ornaments and tools, stones aligned to solstices, figurines of mothers, animals, and gods, marks on pottery that may have carried symbolic meanings. These are not only artifacts of daily life, but fragments of faith. They whisper of a time when humanity first began to see the sacred everywhere. This shift to myth was not a retreat from reality, but an expansion of it. It allowed people to interpret death not as an ending, but as transition. The dead were not gone. They had joined the spirits of earth and sky. They lingered in dreams, in voices heard in wind, in stars seen at night. The boundaries between living and dead, natural and supernatural, human and cosmic blurred into one living continuum. Yet myths also carried tension. One elder might say, the river is a gift of the earth mother, while another might insist, it is the pathway of a serpent spirit. Myths shifted, merged, competed. In this diversity was born imagination itself. A single village could hold many truths at once, each story adding layers of meaning to the world. Philosophically, this was humanity's first confrontation with the unknown. The cosmos was vast, life was fragile, death was inevitable. Myths softened this terror, offering narratives where everything had purpose. A storm was not meaningless destruction, but the voice of a god. A death was not senseless loss, but a journey to the ancestors. This reframing turned fear into reverence, chaos into story. And in those stories, unity was forged. To share a myth was to share identity. It was to speak a language not of words, but of wonder. Around the fire, myth knit people together tighter than walls or weapons ever could. It told them they belonged, not only to one another, but to the earth, the sky, the spirits that surrounded them. Picture a burial at dawn, a young hunter, wrapped in woven cloth, lowered into the earth. A clay vessel placed beside him, filled with food for the journey. Elders chant softly, children scatter seeds into the grave. Smoke rises, carrying prayers upward. The people weep, but they also believe. They believe the hunter will walk again under stars that guide him home. The burial is not only grief, but participation in a mythic cycle. In the myths of earth and sky, humanity learned to live not only with the world, but within it. They began to see existence not as random fragments, but as a story unfolding, a story in which they had a role. And in that role was dignity, purpose, continuity. We, who live millennia later, can still feel the echo. We look at the stars, and they still see more than fire. We bury our dead with words and objects. We tell stories to children to help them face a world of mystery. The myths have changed, but the impulse has not. We too are villagers at the dawn of myth, still trying to make sense of earth and sky. As the centuries passed, villages grew. Families swelled into clans, clans into tribes. What began as a few scattered settlements across rivers and valleys now formed clusters of human presence. With this growth came both opportunity and danger, for no village could remain alone forever. The world pressed against them. Rivers ran into each other, trails converged, hunters wandered far. Inevitably, the paths of tribes would cross. Sometimes these encounters were cautious, sometimes hostile, sometimes wondrous. Imagine two groups meeting at a riverbank. Each carries their own language, their own myths, their own tools. They eye one another warily. Weapons are held tightly at first, though no battle may come. The air is thick with uncertainty. Are they kin or threat? Are they rivals for food or possible allies in survival? When peace was chosen, alliances were born. Tribes might trade stone, shells, or obsidian blades. They might exchange food in times of hunger. Young men and women might marry across groups, weaving kinship ties that bound tribes together. A stranger could become family through ritual, through feasting, through oath. These alliances created networks that stretched across valleys, linking people through blood and trust. But peace was not guaranteed. Competition for fertile land, for hunting grounds, for rivers often ignited conflict. A drought might drive one tribe into the territory of another. A hunting party might kill too many animals in land another group depended on. In such moments, suspicion hardened into rivalry, and rivalry into battle. Archaeology has uncovered skeletons with spear wounds, mass graves that hint at raids and ambushes. The earliest tribal wars were not grand campaigns, but sudden, desperate struggles, fights born of scarcity and survival. Yet even in conflict, rules began to emerge. Not every fight was slaughter. Some disputes were settled with ritual combat, one champion against another. Others ended with truces marked by shared feasts, where enemies sat together in tense silence, eating from the same fire. These practices reveal something deeper. Even as humans clashed, they sought order. They recognized that endless violence destroyed the very resources both sides needed. To survive, even enemies had to limit their hatred. Alliances and rivalries shaped the identity of tribes. To belong to a tribe was to inherit its stories, its victories, its wounds. A scar from battle became a badge of honor. A shared victory became a tale sung around fires. Children grew up hearing not only of their ancestors' spirits, but also of their struggles with neighbors. History was memory, and memory shaped belonging. The gathering of tribes also expanded culture. When groups met peacefully, they exchanged more than goods. They shared songs, dances, myths. A gesture from one tribe might be woven into the ritual of another. A tool design might spread across hundreds of miles, carried in trade networks. Even languages, once isolated, began to echo one another, borrowing words, sounds, rhythms. This mingling enriched humanity, weaving diversity into connection. But with connection came new layers of complexity. Tribes now had reputations. One might be known as skilled hunters, another as stoneworkers, another as fierce warriors. To encounter strangers was no longer to face an unknown people, but to face a name, a story carried by rumor. Reputation itself became a kind of weapon, an invisible force shaping how tribes approached one another. Picture a great gathering at a river plain where several tribes converge for trade. Fires dot the night, drums echo, voices rise in many languages. Shell necklaces glimmer in the light, obsidian blades change hands, woven baskets are displayed proudly. Children from different tribes chase each other in play, while elders sit in council, speaking in gestures and fragments of shared words. This is not just a meeting, it is the seed of civilization, people realizing they are part of something larger than themselves, something bigger than one tribe. At the same time, the shadow of rivalry never fully disappeared. Just beyond the glow of the fires, warriors keep watch, spears in hand, eyes scanning the dark. Trust is fragile, easily broken. A stolen item, a careless insult, an accidental trespass, any spark could reignite conflict. The line between alliance and enmity was thin, shifting with the winds of fortune. Philosophically, this period marked humanity's first experiments with politics. Survival was no longer just about the individual or the family, but about navigating the larger web of relationships. Leaders emerged not only as hunters or warriors, but as negotiators, peacemakers, visionaries who could guide their people through the fragile dance of alliance and rivalry. To lead a tribe now meant more than strength, it meant wisdom, memory, and the gift of foresight. This interplay of cooperation and conflict mirrors the dual nature of humanity itself. We are creatures of empathy and of aggression, capable of generosity and of violence. The gathering of tribes revealed both sides at once. It showed us at our most destructive and our most creative, tearing one another down and building one another up in equal measure. The archaeological record is clear. Without these gatherings, without these exchanges, humanity would have remained scattered. It was in the space between tribes, sometimes hostile, sometimes friendly, that ideas leapt across boundaries. Fire-hardened pottery, new hunting strategies, sacred songs, burial practices, all traveled along these early human networks. Civilization was not born in isolation, but in encounter, in the space where strangers became either rivals or kin. In the flickering fires of tribal gatherings, we see the first glimpses of diplomacy, of war, of trade, of shared culture. We see the fragile balance that would echo through all of human history, the need to unite and the temptation to divide. Humanity learned in these moments that it could not live alone. It was bound, for better or worse, into the destiny of others. And so the tribes gathered, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, always as mirrors of one another. In those mirrors, humanity began to see itself, not only as individuals, not only as families, but as a species. And in that recognition, fragile and profound, lay the seed of everything that was to come. Long before cities rose from the earth, before empires carved their names into stone, there were smaller monuments. Scattered across hills and valleys, early tribes began to build, not for shelter, not for defense, but for meaning. They gathered stones, lifted timbers, and carved earth in ways that spoke not to survival alone, but to spirit. In these acts, humanity revealed something profound, the desire to shape not just the material world, but the invisible one. Imagine a clearing where a circle of stones rises from the ground. Each stone, taller than a person, dragged from far away, set upright with unimaginable effort. No house, no wall, no tomb, only a circle, open to the sky. At dawn, the light of the sun pours between the stones, striking the ground at a precise angle. At night, stars shimmer above, aligned with the pillars. Such a place was not for dwelling, it was for gathering, for worship, for story. It was the first architecture of belief. Archaeology has uncovered such places. Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, older than the pyramids, older even than farming itself, was built by hunter-gatherers more than 11,000 years ago. Enormous T-shaped pillars, carved with animals, lions, snakes, vultures, stand arranged in great circles. No homes were found nearby, no signs of permanent settlement. This was not a village. It was a temple. The effort required to raise these stones suggests tribes came together for something greater than food or shelter. They came for ritual. They came for the sacred. The building of temples marked a turning point in human thought. For the first time, people were not only shaping their environment for survival but for meaning. Sacred stones became anchors of memory, marking where people had gathered, prayed, and celebrated. They became cosmic calendars, aligning with solstices and equinoxes. In their shadows, myths were told, songs were sung, and ancestors were remembered. But what compelled such effort? Why drag stones weighing tons across hills? Why carve beasts into stone with painstaking detail? The answer may lie in the human hunger for connection, not only to each other, but to forces greater than themselves. To the sky, to the earth, to the mysteries of life and death. These temples embodied a truth humans needed, places where the visible and invisible could meet. Sacred stones also served as unifying symbols. Tribes that once met in rivalry could gather under shared rituals. A temple became neutral ground, a place where feasts could be held, alliances confirmed, disputes resolved. To stand before the sacred was to be reminded that all were bound by forces beyond their control, the rising sun, the flowing river, the endless stars. The architecture itself became a mediator of peace. Yet temples also reinforced hierarchy. To build them required leadership, organization, and authority. Some guided the vision, others labored under command. The sacred created power. Those who claimed to speak for the gods or interpret the stars gained influence. Thus, religion and politics intertwined at their very birth. The first sacred stones were also the first thrones, seats of power disguised as devotion. Consider the rituals these places may have witnessed: fires lit at night, smoke rising to the heavens, dancers moving in circles, their shadows flickering against the pillars, drums echoing like heartbeats, chants rising in many voices, offerings laid upon altars, grain, carved figurines, even blood. Each act bound the tribe together, each ritual deepened identity. To belong was to know the rhythm of the ceremonies, the meaning of the symbols carved in stone. The imagery of animals carved into pillars speaks volumes. These were not decorations, they were guardians, spirits, symbols of the world as people saw it. The vulture may have represented death, the serpent rebirth, the lion strength. The stones became a library of symbols, a language written in rock, carrying meaning across generations. Even when words faded, the carvings remained, whispering stories into the silence of time. Temples were also aligned with the heavens. Ancient builders watched the skies with careful eyes. They noted the rising of certain stars, the path of the sun, the shifting of the moon. They built not randomly, but with cosmic precision. These alignments transformed architecture into astronomy, ritual into calendar. Temples told people when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter. The sacred and the practical merged in stone. And yet there was mystery. Many of these sites seem to have been deliberately buried, covered with earth as if hidden on purpose. Göbekli Tepe itself was entombed, preserved beneath soil for thousands of years. Why? Was it an act of reverence, a way of returning the sacred to the earth? Or was it fear of forces too great to leave exposed? The intentional burial suggests that even those who built these temples felt their power linger long after ritual ended. In the philosophy of sacred architecture, we glimpse humanity's earliest attempt to transcend mortality. Stones endure where bodies decay. Carvings remain when voices fade. A temple was a promise that memory would outlast flesh. To raise a sacred stone was to declare, we were here. We believed. We reached for the eternal. This longing echoes through history. From the earliest circles of stones to the great pyramids, from hidden jungle temples to soaring cathedrals, humans have returned again and again to the act of building for the sacred. It began here, in these first hidden temples, where tribes carved meaning into stone. The story of sacred stones is not only about worship, but about identity. These places shaped how humans saw themselves, no longer as scattered tribes, but as a people capable of shaping the cosmos in their image. To step into a stone circle was to step into a story larger than the self, a story of sky and earth, of gods and ancestors. In the stillness of these stones, we hear the heartbeat of humanity's spirit. They remind us that survival was never enough. From the beginning, we sought not only to live but to belong, to one another, to the universe, to something beyond time. And in that search, we raised the first temples, where the human soul met the eternal sky. Night falls on the lost continent. The sun sinks, shadows lengthen, and the world grows cold. But in the heart of a clearing, a fire flickers. Its orange glow pushes back the darkness, creating a circle of light in a sea of night. Around it, people gather, faces lit by flame, eyes reflecting the dance of sparks. Here, in this sacred glow, humanity invented something as powerful as stone tools, as enduring as temples: the art of story. Fire was more than warmth or protection. It was the stage on which imagination was born. Gathered around flames, people were safe from predators, free from the day's labor, open to wonder. In this liminal space between light and shadow, myths began to take shape. One voice would rise, weaving words into patterns, while others listened in silence, hearts beating in rhythm with the story. The fire itself seemed to respond, crackling like applause, throwing shadows that acted out the tale. The first stories were not merely entertainment, they were survival. Myths taught lessons about the world, which plants healed, which animals to avoid, where the rivers ran, when the rains would come. Wrapped in narrative, knowledge became unforgettable. A tale about a spirit who lived in the river taught respect for its currents. A legend of a trickster animal warned of dangers in the forest. Stories carried wisdom across generations, long before writing carved it into stone. But beyond survival, myths gave meaning. They explained mysteries no one could solve: why thunder roared, why stars moved across the sky, why death came for all. To a people surrounded by vast unknowns, myth was a light in the dark, an answer where silence had reigned. The gods, the spirits, the ancestors, all came alive in the firelight, their voices echoing through the mouths of storytellers. Ritual grew alongside story. Words alone were powerful, but when joined with rhythm, dance, and song, they became transformative. Around the fire, bodies moved in circles, imitating animals, reenacting hunts, dramatizing the struggles of life. A hunt was not just remembered, but performed. A death was not just mourned, but transformed into myth. Ritual allowed people to relive, retell, and reshape their experiences, binding the tribe in a shared vision of reality. The storyteller was more than a speaker. They were a keeper of memory, a weaver of identity. Their words could unite, inspire, and heal. Some stories were humorous, light-hearted tales of clever animals or foolish tricksters. Others were solemn, invoking ancestors and spirits. All carried weight. The storyteller's voice was a bridge between past and future, between visible and invisible. Myths also shaped morality. In the tales told at night, courage was rewarded, greed punished, generosity praised. Stories became mirrors, teaching tribes how to live, how to treat one another, how to honor the earth. They carried values more deeply than laws ever could, because they were not enforced by punishment but carried by imagination. A child who heard of the selfish hunter who starved because he refused to share would never forget the lesson. The universality of myths is striking. Across continents, cultures that never met invented similar themes. Flood myths appear in many traditions, stories of waters rising, cleansing the world, leaving only a few survivors. Tricksters, cunning animals or spirits who broke rules, exist in countless societies. Sky gods, earth mothers, heroes who journeyed and returned, all echo across time. Around countless fires, humanity dreamed the same dreams. Why do myths converge? Perhaps because they rise from shared human experience. The cycle of seasons, the terror of storms, the certainty of death, all humans faced them, and all sought answers. Story provided a map for the unknown, turning fear into narrative, chaos into meaning. In myth, the unpredictable became familiar, the frightening became explainable. Firelight also shaped the very form of storytelling. Shadows stretched across rocks, making the world alive. A storyteller might gesture toward the flames, their hands creating images, giants, beasts, gods. The fire was the first screen, the first stage, where imagination took visible form. In this sense, every film, every performance, every book is an echo of that circle of light. These stories were not static. Each telling changed with the teller, with the audience, with the moment. A hunter returning from danger might add his experience to an old tale. A mother comforting a child might soften the story's edge. Myths evolved like living beings, adapting, surviving, thriving in memory. But beyond knowledge and morality, myths also offered comfort. Around the fire, the tribe could face fears together: death, hunger, storms, the vastness of the night sky. Myth told them they were not alone, that spirits watched, ancestors guided, gods cared. Even in suffering, meaning could be found. Myths gave people a reason to endure, a reason to hope. The birth of storytelling was also the birth of imagination itself. It allowed people to imagine what was not, to picture what could be. Story opened the mind to possibility. It was the seed of creativity, of invention, of philosophy. In the fire's glow, humanity became more than animal, it became visionary. As flames burned low and stars emerged, stories did not end. They became dreams. Children fell asleep by the fire, carrying myths into the realm of imagination. In dreams, stories lived on, reshaped, reborn. And when morning came, the cycle continued. Fire by night, sun by day, story without end. From sacred stones to sacred words, humanity discovered a power greater than any weapon or tool, the ability to imagine, to narrate, to believe. Myths, born of firelight, became the foundation of culture. They guided lives, inspired rituals, shaped morality, and comforted hearts. Even today, when we sit in darkened theaters or gather around glowing screens, we are repeating that ancient act, sharing stories in the light, seeking meaning in the dark. The fire still burns. Its echoes live in every tale told, every myth remembered, every story we pass on. In its glow, we remain connected, not only to each other, but to those first tribes who once sat in circles, their voices rising against the night. Every story of creation carries hidden within it a story of loss. Continents rise, but they also fall. Landscapes endure, but they also vanish. The lost continent where the first tribes lived, whether we call it Sundaland, Lemuria, or Atlantis, was not eternal. It had a beginning, and it had an end. To understand its disappearance is to glimpse the raw forces of Earth itself, forces that shape not only geology but destiny. When we imagine a continent disappearing, we often picture sudden catastrophe, earthquakes shattering mountains, volcanoes drowning valleys, or oceans swallowing land overnight. Yet, in truth, the vanishing of this ancient world was far more patient, yet just as merciless. It began with ice, long before the tribes had fire or language. During the Ice Age, vast sheets of frozen water locked away the oceans, lowering sea levels by hundreds of feet. Where seas exist today, dry plains once stretched, binding islands into continents, rivers into highways. It was on this exposed land that early tribes flourished. But as the climate shifted, the ice began to melt. Slowly, steadily, seas crept back across the lowlands. What had once been fertile plains turned to marsh, then to shallows, then to open sea. Hills became islands. Valleys became bays. Entire forests sank beneath the waves, their canopies swallowed in silence. For those who lived there, the world was not static. It was dissolving, retreating, transforming with every generation. Imagine a child born in one village, raised to hear stories of forests stretching forever. By adulthood, that forest would already be half submerged. By old age, the land itself would be gone, only the waves remaining. For the tribes, the world seemed unstable, untrustworthy. Land that had sheltered their ancestors could not even survive their lifetime. Their stories would carry this sense of loss, giving birth to myths of floods, angry gods, and vanished homelands. Science confirms what myths preserve. The seas rose with devastating persistence. Around 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than today. As the world warmed, the oceans climbed. By 10,000 years ago, coastlines were redrawn at a pace faster than at almost any other point in history. The lost continent was not erased in a single night, but over centuries, its heartlands drowned piece by piece, generation by generation. Yet, to the people who lived it, gradual change could feel like sudden catastrophe. A village washed away by a storm surge. A river swallowed by a widening estuary. A burial ground gone forever beneath the tide. What the earth performed slowly, the tribes experienced suddenly, moments of devastation punctuating years of creeping change. It is no coincidence that flood myths appear across so many cultures. The Bible speaks of Noah. The Mesopotamians told of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Greeks remembered Deucalion and Pyrrha. In India, the god Vishnu guided Manu to survive the flood. In every story, humanity teeters on the edge of annihilation, saved only by the wisdom of a chosen few. These myths, scattered across the world, may all echo the memory of rising seas, of lands swallowed whole, of continents lost. But loss is never merely physical, it is also spiritual. To see one's homeland sink beneath the waves is to lose more than soil. It is to lose the graves of ancestors, the places of ritual, the paths walked since childhood. The drowned continent was not just territory, it was memory, identity, belonging. No wonder myths tell of longing, of return, of worlds beneath the ocean that still glow with life. Archaeology offers tantalizing glimpses of this vanished world. Off the coasts of India, Japan, and Southeast Asia, divers have found submerged structures, stone walls, foundations, even what may be temples, buried under centuries of silt. In places like Doggerland in the North Sea, researchers have uncovered tools, bones, and artifacts from a land now drowned. Each discovery whispers of a lost age, when people lived where only waves now roll. Geology tells another part of the tale. The continents are not fixed, they drift on plates of stone, floating over molten earth. Some rise, others fall. Volcanic eruptions reshape islands in an instant. Earthquakes split the ground open. Tectonic shifts can create mountain ranges, or sink valleys. The lost continent's fate was sealed by these movements, as the land itself was ground, tilted, and submerged. What today we call natural disaster was to them apocalypse. And yet, from disappearance came rebirth. As seas rose, tribes were forced to move. They became wanderers, sailors, inventors. They learned to adapt to coastlines, to fish, to build rafts and canoes. The very loss of their homeland forced them outward, scattering across oceans and continents. The drowned land became the mother of migration, the spark of exploration. Even in memory, the lost continent did not die. Its echoes lived on in the myths of survivors. To this day, stories of sunken lands linger in folklore. The Celtic people spoke of High Brazil, an island west of Ireland that appeared only once every 7 years. Polynesian navigators told of Hawaii, a homeland beneath the waves. The Japanese remembered Ryugyujo, the Dragon King's palace beneath the sea. All are shadows of the same wound, the memory of land once walked, now lost to the deep. Philosophically, the disappearance of a continent raises haunting questions. What does it mean for humanity to lose its foundation? How do we endure when the very ground beneath us vanishes? The tribes of the lost continent answered not with despair, but with story. By telling of floods, of gods, of journeys, they transformed catastrophe into narrative, grief into meaning. Their land may have drowned, but their culture learned to swim. Perhaps this is the deeper truth of the lost continent, not that it vanished, but that it lives on in us. In every story of a flood, in every tale of exile, in every dream of return to a golden homeland, we carry its memory. The continent itself may be gone, but its people survived, scattered like seeds across the earth. From their dispersal grew civilizations, languages, myths, and eventually us. The earth is not finished with such stories. Even now, coastlines shift, islands erode, glaciers melt, seas rise again. The fate of the lost continent is not only the past, it is also the future. Our modern cities, built along shores, are vulnerable to the same inexorable tides. We too may one day become storytellers around a fire, speaking of lands swallowed by the sea. The disappearance of the lost continent is a reminder that permanence is an illusion. What we think eternal may be fragile. What we build may vanish. Yet in that impermanence lies the secret of resilience. For though the land was lost, humanity was not. We carried the memory, the myth, the firelight forward. And in doing so, we transformed loss into legacy. The continent is gone, but its echoes remain, in stone tools dredged from the sea, in myths passed down through centuries, in the restless tides themselves. Its disappearance was not an end, but a transition, a passage from land into story, from reality into legend. The lost continent may be drowned, but it is not forgotten. And perhaps that is what matters most. For as long as we remember, the continent still lives, not beneath the waves, but within the human imagination.